thank you all for coming again. Thank you to those of you who are here again. I see some familiar faces. I'm not going to go over what I did in the last two lectures. I think it'll just be too tedious for those who are kind enough to come again. But I just tell you that the last lecture, that last Monday, was looking at the sort of history of this notion of fieldwork in philosophy as a description, as I'm taking it, as a diagnostic, and as a design, and looking at how it's been used in the past. That's what I focused on last week, on the ways in which John Austin, the ordinary language philosopher, first used it, and then the ways in which Pierre Bourdieu picked it up, and then Paul Ravenel. The latter two all referring to the fact that the term itself was from Austin, but not knowing or not acknowledging, perhaps they knew but didn't acknowledge, the essay on which it was based and where it appeared, the only time the term appeared, which was in A Plea for Excuses, which is just an extraordinary essay, as I mentioned 2 weeks ago, and really worth seeing and looking at what he actually does with excuses. So last week I got caught off at 23 pages, and there are 35, and there's lots more left, but I'm not going to give you the end of that last lecture, because what I want to talk about today is how I'm thinking of this project of concept work, and something more concrete, more grounded, less abstract than what I've done before. And hopefully it will give you some sense, I keep using this term, the motility of concepts, the movement of concepts, and their moments of arrest. And a lot of people do focus on the motility or the mobility more. But I think we still have some ways to go to understand those moments in which a concept takes hold, arrests, and then gets reconfigured and taken up in another way. So this piece, this chapter is something I've been working on, this chapter. It's a lecture, I know, but it's a chapter for me. A chapter in a long sequence of thinking both with Foucault, against Foucault, and about colonies, and about camps. And its title is Motility of Concepts and Their Moments of Arrest on Colony and Camp. And I want to start with a quote that I love and that I return to all the time because it just helps me think better, I think. And it's a quote from Foucault on the ethics of discomfort. An obvious fact gets lost, not when it's replaced by another, which is fresher or cleaner, but when one begins to detect the very conditions that made it obvious, the familiarities which served as its support, the obscurities upon which its clarity was based. I think this is just so clean, so powerful, so without jargon. And all these things that, coming from afar, that carried it secretly and made it such that it was, quote, obvious. Concept formation is an opaque process. Concept recognition, a deceptively simple act. Both obscure how readily we assign to concepts the appearance of stable things. How many times do we need to remind ourselves and our readers that concepts conceal the scenes of their making, as Derrida wrote so many years ago, and Gaichi Spivak has picked up upon? How often do we need to warn ourselves that naming them offers only the false security that we thereby recognize, that to which they refer, that we can thereby manipulate their use, and count on and assure ourselves of their portability? Both concept formation. Well, one thing I wanted to say also, This particular lecture is part of two, and I've just really basically cut it in half. Okay, it's actually quite a long piece on colony and camp. It's very historically grounded, and I hope very analytically enabling at the same time. And it's impossible for me to squeeze it into one lecture, so that those of you who are interested, please know that a lot of the details of the kinds of colony and camp we're looking at are going to come up in next week's lecture. Both concept formation and concept recognition are radically contingent on what we differently imagine concepts are. That's just a starting point right there, what they are. That's being put on the table. What they do, what we take to be the distinguishing features that differentiate them from common nouns. They shape the parameters of research, stretch us across unexpected sites of inquiry, constrain the viability of comparisons, something that came up last week, and that's very crucial to this, and point us to what we might consider an exemplary case. So just even whatever that concept and what we impart to it already determines in some sense what the case could be. An exemplary case or what is an exception. Okay, it already defines what has to be outside of it. Sometimes concepts are placeholders for what we are not yet equipped to spell out or willing to say. Just got off the plane, so to speak. Sometimes they're shorthands and signposts that tell the reader and ourselves that we are able participants in a high-profile debate about neoliberalism or imperial formations or biopolitics or security studies, and have the competence, therefore, to participate in that conversation. So just imparting, using it right there, gives us some leverage. I think we sometimes imagine. We bristle at those concepts that get in our way, celebrate those that take us to places we would otherwise not have thought to go. When we speak of and with concepts all the time, leveraging them to our service. But that is decidedly different, I'm arguing, than addressing explicitly the force they command and how they do so. Given that concept analysis has long been considered a core domain of philosophy, and that cognitive science has flourished in the last 50 years, precisely around the much debated question of what kinds of things concepts are. And these are obviously two fields that rarely line up, and certainly history and cognitive science. We don't even go near cognitive science. It's a science, and it's out there. It's positivism, something we don't dwell upon. So they've really asked these fascinating questions about what kinds of things these concepts are, the constraints. This is how they word it: constraints that govern their acquisition and origin, their use. Not to say reassessments of the distinctions drawn between primitive and complex concepts, or between a priori and a posterior ones. However, given this, I think it's not untoward to ask more about what they promise. What is the promise, and we all may have different ones that we imagine that promise to be. What they yield and conceal, and the kinds of implicit work we do with them. Cognitive psychologists have some interesting things to tell us, I think, and I don't think we've exploited that field enough. They tell us that concepts are mental representations, which I don't agree. Units of thought that connect those representations to entities in the world, that provide us with a secure hold on the chaos of our minds. That's a parse of at least 15 books in Introduction to Cognitive Psychology, right? And the world around us. But that definition skirts their very protean qualities, the multiple tasks they perform, how they detach partially or wholly from the entities to which they are imagined to refer, and then careen, that is, just quickly move beyond the sensibilia from which we are told that they emanate. So concepts are that which is supposed to be tied to right? Those objects. But how tied they are is not always clear. They are sometimes askew to the entities in the world they are commissioned to order and capture. Still, it's striking how much the historical specificity of concepts elude the grasp of cognitive psychology, elude their interest, the motility of concepts, their capacity to expand and contract. So right there, with my own students, I see that as an enormously difficult task. How do you historicize and problematize how they expand and contract? Right there, just stop right there and go home. I mean, that is already a really, really difficult. They don't stay in the same space. Sometimes to be capacious, other times constricting. And with respect to one of my concerns tonight, to their restive qualities, that restless, restive quality that concepts have. As Warren Montag, a wonderful philosopher, Pierre Machary, Althusser, has written, he writes so perceptively of Pierre Machary's work with concept. It is their filiations, not just their vibration, but the filiations, as much as their mutations to which we need to attend. So a lot of work argues that it deals with this mutation. I'm not sure how much it does, but the filiations, that is what gets tethered to it, to particular concepts, what other ones come in their wake, what they pull towards them, is politically one of the issues I'm really interested in pursuing. Consolate's development of conceptual history and the vast and diffuse research program it's inspired could be said to move in a similar direction. But Consolate's abiding concern with Marginity's precedents opens, I think, to a very different scale of historical periodization and temporalization, and to a very different archive of how knowledge things are assembled, which is, as some of you might remember, how Paul Ravenel defines fieldwork in philosophy, that remains squarely within the bounds of what is already recognized as political concepts. The contingencies of conceptual history are not conceived, and this is the major difference of Consolate's work, in the minor and grittier nodes where common sense and the self-evident harbor, right? So Consolate's project, and one which has been so influential in the States, and speaking to colleagues here, I've heard it's not as influential here, though I'd love to hear about it, but in the US, Consulate. It's very, very interesting how these things travel and don't. Nor do they linger, this is in Consolate's conceptual history project, in the throes of worldly conceptual labor, where such terms as intimacy, sexuality, and resentment, so totally off the charts of Consolate's agenda, can be mobilized to distinguish different social kinds and to monitor the politically dangerous affective relations those social kinds are imagined to harbor. Adi Ophir helps us think differently about what fieldwork and philosophy might track with his attention to what he calls conceptual performance. In his rendition, concepts are not cognitive instruments, nor part of our mental equipment, but discursive performances, discursive scenes, sort of picking up a bit on Derrida and Judith Butler, I think, in which concepts are carved out, not ordinary, but extraordinary practices that locate where fieldwork in philosophy happens. Well, in his rendition, concept work and this making and thinking of concept as performance is something that one does consciously. I would argue that concept work may also happen, as it were, behind our backs. Not in the moments in which they are freshly reconceived and performed, as Adi Ophir insists, but in a less explicitly exercised labor, when a concept extends and messes with its confines and exerts metaphoric, denotative, affective, and surreptitious force. I take these moments of loose association and the connectivities they make possible as one way to access the changing terms of political logics. Political logics, that's a lot of my interest in political logics and political rationalities. And what I take to be one of the key spaces in which fieldwork and philosophy may effectively work. The actual work we do with concepts, how we discern their movement and reckon and depend on their portability, how we decide on their applicability, what we reject in their features that don't fit our agendas, the connections they enable that we do or do not pursue, because there are lots that will just, if they don't fit what we're working on, they just end up being marginality to the side. How we come up with new ones are not only opaque. In much of colonial and post-colonial history on which I work, and a good deal of social inquiry, be it ethnographic, sociological, historical work, those procedures, the ones I've just listed, command little attention in deliberation. They're just not really considered. In an earlier lecture, I cited, I guess it was in the first one, Michel de Certeau's fascination with how Foucault came to think otherwise, penser autrement, and differently, and with the philosophers who inspired him, with the historians he rarely quoted, he hardly ever cited anybody, right? We've all wondered why. And on which his work would so firmly depend. But concept formation itself seems to warrant little sanctioned space. There's no clear corpus of reference, no secured quarters for investigation, I thought. Or perhaps one could argue the very opposite. That although Foucault only gave 8 brief pages to the formation of concepts in the archaeology of knowledge, in fact his entire corpus is packed into and impacted in these dense, taut, and difficult pages. It's here that he names his effort to account for the simultaneous appearance and recurrence of concepts whose compatibility belies, I quote, the different, apparently opposed systems, unquote, in which they operate. And what he was interested in, a term he kept using, was in their field, it is their field of presence that he encourages us to attend, as much as to those statements criticized, discussed, judged, as well as those rejected. So that rejection for me is key. That which falls outside what we should be talking about, those that get excluded. Arnold Davidson, philosopher at the University of Chicago, elegantly parses a key methodological move in Foucault's work around concept formation in this way. That, I quote, it is only within a new field of stabilization that a concept will obey new conditions of inscription, thus modifying its identity. I think this may be right, but this is only one way in which concepts matter to the political logics which they enact and express. I see as much political traction. Remember, that is what I'm looking for, is political traction and potential insight in precisely those moments in which there is no field of stabilization. When political concepts waver, when they're moving, when it's unsure where they're going to settle, uncertain as to which rationalities they adhere and call upon to secure their relevance and their credibility. So it is those moments of radical doubt, those moments of wavering, in which I focus methodologically a lot of my attention. Not when everybody knows what imperial formation is, or everybody knows what a colony is. It's precisely those moments when people go, wait a minute, I'm not sure we do. Do we? Are we going to use this? Are we going to go use that? What kinds of police actions are we going to use based on that notion of the concept? Concepts that are not endowed with clarity, and this is important, with resolute reference and a commanding space, are often referred to as quasi-concepts. It's a term that's being used quite a lot, quasi-concepts. But such a term, I think, already implicitly subscribes to a notion that concepts, when they are in their proper form, do not vacillate. in a gray zone between common noun and a conditioned context that gives them more conceptual force and organizing weight. To remind us of the fragility of concepts, rather than their stable features, Machachi invites us to examine their capacity to morph, and I would argue to lead us astray, which does more than reduce to Cosselet's warning that, I quote, a concept must remain ambiguous to be one. Deleuze and Guattari, too, insist that concepts are not waiting for us ready-made. So that right there in the work that a lot of us do in social inquiry, this doesn't mean everyone nor everyone in this room, but we do see concepts sitting out there and they're kind of ready-made, and then we go and investigate what's the best definition of them. They entice us with a possibility in the opening chapter to What is Philosophy, after providing at least 8 variations on the statement that the object of philosophy is to create concepts that are always new, that we might think about a task of more reasonable dimensions than Kant's Universal Encyclopedia. And what they call this is a pedagogy of the concept. I'm intrigued by this phrase, a pedagogy of the concept. It shows up in the third to left line of one of the chapters, and it's sort of left as a dangling participle. I'm intrigued by the notion, but it's not clear exactly what Deleuze and Guattari imagine as a pedagogy to be. Pedagogy as a principal set of procedures is not what they offer. So they're not going to kind of set out for us a lesson plan of what you do if you want to study a concept. I mean, given that it's Deleuze and Guattari, you know they're going to do actually the opposite. Do everything to make it impossible for you to get there. They tell us what they imagine concepts to do, rather than actually what they imagine them to be, instructing us how to resist the desire for consensus. And here you'd see those echoes of Rancière, a move that dissensus is the only side of the political, of a desire for consensus and certainties, even rejecting something which I do. So again, putting me, off, weight, destabilized, even rejecting, as they say, the productive connections as the goal of conceptual labor. Isabelle Stengers, I mentioned before, a Belgian historian of science, notes their enigmatic book, What is Philosophy? And she says, may well be the most political of Deleuze and Guattari's writings. If fieldwork in philosophy is more than an invocation of conceptual frames already in place, cultivating the capacity to set askew and reject goodwill, that's what she's saying. We must reject the goodwill among us of social science, of our colleagues, and patting each other on the back. This should warrant our attention. But it's an analytic goodwill that she's sort of playing with in her phrasing of this rather enigmatic book of What is Philosophy. John Austin was surely right, as I mentioned last week, that the notion that we possess concepts like we do furniture is a misleading metaphor, and a not particularly helpful one. Might we abandon possession and start instead with a lesson from Hegel? Although I, and perhaps many of you are not Hegelian philosophers, or many of you are, and I'm not, so I don't know which way we go on that. Might we embrace Hegel's insight and still abjure obeisance to his authority? Might we think with what he takes as principle in a concept's process of production? He's one of the few people that actually uses the term the process of production. Namely that a concept gives actuality to itself through the shapes that it assumes, is what he says. That it gives actuality, so it doesn't actually have an actuality that it latches onto in advance, but that it gives that actuality in the very process of its making. Concepts occur in constellations. They draw other concepts into their fold, and that's what I'm really interested in, is what gets caught in that fold. As Deleuze and Guattari define it, it's a point of coincidence, condensation, and accumulation. And I think political concepts do something more. They intervene in the allocation of power, authorize and sanction what is deemed political, right there. Survey, and Deleuze-Guattari used this term in French, survol, very unclear what they mean. It sort of rides over it. It commands authority over. Survey what counts as a political situation or a political event. So let's look to the concept I'd like to work with today. Here my interest is in a concept, that of a colony, that acquires its critical force precisely because it is not commonly considered a political concept at all, which is why I chose it. Because it has been so long considered benign and removed from the domain of contemporary politics. One way to make its presence felt is to glean its potency from the veiled fashion in which it crafts subjects, requisitions objects, brings in objects close to it, and then couches its command. I seize upon it because of the traction I think it offers, it affords. It innocuously grabs conceptual hold by offering a way to think otherwise about what is assigned as common usage and common sense. It scrambles received associations, counters the silence of political decorum and the distracting noise of analytic convention. A colony inhabits an ambiguous sort of space. Philosophers bypass it. There's absolutely one philosopher I know of who's become my dearest friend, who's ever taken the colony, not colonialism, not colonization, not imperialism. I'm being very, very specific here. The colony as a space to investigate. Philosophers don't deal with it at all. As a common noun, with no conceptual cachet, it's referenceful too easily into unproblematic space. Political theorists prefer to grapple with the more compelling isms which the colony instantiates. Colonizer and colonized are known to be the parties to which it gives rise. Definitional authority over what colonialism is or is not is a contest, perceived to have high political stakes. So everybody's always debating, is that really colonialism? Is it really not? Is the U.S. really undoing colonialism? Is its empire without colonialism? For students of social forms, too, a colony warrants virtually no intellectual work. Sociologists and anthropologists like myself, who favor delineated context and concrete moments, offer descriptive profiles of a particular colony, be it a settler colony or a penal colony, and proceed to compare any one such case with others that already meet, and this is important, that already meet received and prior requirements for inclusion, and thereafter designation. Among those of us who work in this mode, a colony tends to be treated as transparent. Everybody knows what a colony is. It describes a physical and social location, a place, a specified disaggregated population of colonizer and colonized, and those caught in between. Distinctions productive of and dependent upon unequal entitlements to resources and rights, on conquest as dispossession, on dispossession as progress, and not least on a requisite set of embodied, racialized, and sexualized relations. But I'm going to argue that this is only one version of its manifestation and its capacious political career. None of these points of entry broach the force fields in which the term colony has operated, nor the global, geopolitical, and historical breadth of the political visions embedded within it. Each assumes an essence rather than follow its range of coordinates. It ascribes rather than questions what a colony is. Such starting points are poorly positioned to address a colony's range of mutations. Not least, a foundational, if shadowed feature is lost. Namely, that the colony, the penal colony, the military colony, the settler colony, the 19th century agricultural colonies, the colonies agricoles, in England, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France, are marked by the instability of its morphology and the instability of the political mandates to which its architects and agents subscribe. Such vantage points are ill-poised to address what Hannah Arendt called, I quote, the wild confusion of historical terminology, unquote, to which imperial formations gave rise. Few, Hannah Arendt among them, have asked whether this wild confusion is significant in itself. So she's noted the wild confusion in the origins of totalitarianism, but never asked what it's constituted out of and what are the conditions of possibility for that confusion. Already knowing what a colony is precludes asking whether ambiguous nomenclatures, competing visions, repeated failures, and reversals of course, and the violences, and the fortress settledness they engender, prefigure the colony as something else. Not as a site of settlement, that is the first definition. The colony is a site of white settlement, usually. Not as a site of settlement, but as an always unstable and precarious project, plagued by the expected promise and the fear of its becoming another sort of entity. The next section is on colony again, commensurabilities called forth in a poem. With this in mind, I turn to one of the fundamental challenges in the treatment of colonial histories. And this is where this comes from, not a deep interest in philosophy. This project comes out of this historical archive and this history of the present that concerns me. What might a genealogy of imperial practices look like that neither succumbs to a teleology of the present, like everything's led up to where we are now, right? Nor is it restricted to the policed categories of colonial archives themselves. Is it possible to write something else that doesn't stay within those confines? A teleology, which we know it already because we're right here, right? Or that we have to work within the bounds of what is already designated as a colonial archive. And that's a project I've been working on for 10 or 15 years, is thinking what are the methodological, analytic methods one can deploy to not have to repeat that the good guys are white and the bad guys are, the bad guys are white and the good guys are, or whoever you want the good and bad guys to be. So that you don't end up just fitting in to a script already provided for you. What might we broach the recess spaces of imperial entailments, whose recognition may be obscured by unfamiliar associations, ambiguous terminology, and when they're given other names. In treating these often subjacent durabilities as objects of inquiry, not as given facts. So it's exactly those occlusions which interest me. What once figured as a clear distinction between colonial and metropolitan contexts not only refigures in unexpected ways, they challenge our conceptual and comparative conventions. Such a venture might resist the obvious starting points between the old and new empires that so much of historiography was once inclined to accept. So everybody, people work on old colonies and the VOC, the Far East Trading Company in the 17th century, don't know a thing about 19th century, Cape Town or 19th century Indonesia. Nor are they expected to, nor is there any conversation between them. The ambiguous qualities of imperial formations, though, are not attributes of more modern imperial forms, as we've sometimes suggested. The tensions between this evasive and blatant practice, and that's another subject that I've been thinking with for a long time, is evasion and the blatancy of certain kinds of practices are constitutive of the political concepts that have long made up imperial logics of security and surveillance. Imperial formations are macro polities of deferral and postponement. And this is a point I've long argued, that they're always about when you're ready for X, then X, Y will come. But they are also something more. They produce recurrent, restless recalibrations and redistributions of detention, confinement, as well as mobilization. Mapping these is no easy task, because there's nothing linear about it, nor is it progressive. Colonial archives constrict that possibility, and they obstruct our task. It makes it really hard to do it if you stay inside what is deemed a colonial archive. If colonial archives are technologies of rule, as I've suggested they are for a long time, and so have others, here those practices manifest in what is censored or deemed irrelevant, in omissions and in relations they refuse to make. So once again, I'm underscoring that it's not only where the emphasis is put, but where the emphasis is not put, that I'm interested in trying to get hold of. If colonial archives create lines of severance. And that's a really important part of what they do. They create lines of severance, boundaries of jurisdiction, categories of persons ostensibly outside the rubrics of colonizer and colonized, excised from the polity of nation or empire, but tethered and bound to colonial locations as they are transported and confined across imperial domains. Severed, disabled histories are what imperial formations produce. These are the opacities in which they invest, which they nourish, and on which they depend. One dominant response to these severed histories and to the insistent sequestering of national history from colonial ones has been to turn the tables, and this is quite true right now in German colonial history, on the conventional wisdom that once dictated the directionality of development of the institutions and technologies of modern governance, where they were first honed and the extent to which structured violences are inherent to them. If the exclusionary principles and practices of liberalism came under scrutiny a decade ago as the foundation of British Empire, today it is the exterminating and genocidal colonial policies that are seen to have provided, and these are the words used, the precursors, incubators, models for the technologies and visions that have been the cornerstone of Nazism of European nation states. So there's a huge literature that's really across Europe right now making that inverse argument, okay? German policies in Africa have been argued to prepare for the Holocaust, rendering it not a unique event, but as part of what Sven Linkfast, among others, now identify as common European heritage. On French terrain, the imperial shaping of national history has exploded as well. Algerian internment camps of the 1840s and France's genocidal colonial policies are no longer cordoned off as aberrant perturbations apart from the national order of things, but traced as systemic violences, part of the deep, if unwelcome history of racial France today. Now, everyone agrees with this at all, so the historians and political theorists who are doing that work are actually accused of not being good historians and not the real thing, so a lot of their work has been dismissed. For England, a strong case has been made for an extensive and deadly system of detention camps instituted by the British in Kenya in the 1950s, wherein as many as 320,000 people were detained, with many more cordoned off in military-zoned villages. Here, too, genocide and the characteristic technologies of a gulag are unmoored from their European sites, relocated as the common but acknowledged workings of racially defined imperial states. These new histories had been one way to do what Depeche Chakrabarty, most people don't know the book, but they definitely know the title, Provincializing Europe, to provincialize Europe. But they too often still retain the same categories, metropole and colony as the defining axis. So instead of going one way, now it goes the other. They are less concerned with the broader movements of shared visions and knowledge that underwrite the political logics across imperial terrains. Ferreting out the ordinary moment of the technologies of incarceration, detention, inquisition, effectively insists that what were once conceived as wholly European political projects were in fact imperial ones. Right? We know this. However, such revised and often reversed histories, I think may flatten. It's not that I'm disagreeing with them wholly, but I think they flatten out a more complex set of exchanges, transpositions of political projects, and conceptual frames that moved neither just from colony to metropole, nor only the other way around. So a reversal doesn't really do the trick. One task then is to consider what methodological renovations might be needed to write histories that yield neither to smooth continuity à la Braudel, right, the long durée, nor to abrupt epical breaks, as Foucault's work has been parodied, I think, but that rather capture the uneven, recursive qualities, that is recursion, that folding back, of the visions and practices that imperial formations have animated, both what they have succeeded and failed to put in place. There is obviously no one preferred way to track them, but here I pursue this work in two different registers, methodologically and analytically joined. The first, by following quite literally the citational references of a document on colonies agricoles, agricultural colonies from the mid-19th century, that includes kinds of colonies that bear and seem to bear absolutely no resemblance to the more common use of the term. Adhering close, as I do this, to the unsure affiliations it recognizes between different sorts of colonies that are seemingly incommensurate in mode of defining. We go, oh, okay, they just happen to be using the same word. Really has nothing to do with one another. Such affiliations sometimes converge in specific content, other times in visionary form. Pursuing them, and this is back, we're on the colony, okay? We're still with the colony, not quite with the camp. Pursuing them extends and refigures Foucault's founding concept in Discipline and Punish, the carceral archipelago, which is the last chapter of the carceral of Discipline and Punish. In time and place, across a broader imperial map that rebinds the genealogies of penal colonies, settler colonies, detention camps in France and Algeria, a Philadelphia prison, poor colonies in the Dutch countryside, Russian orphanages, camps that were refitted as sites for potential colonial settlers, and then failed settler colonies that were militarized with soldier settlers. Now, these are not my affiliations. The most important thing for you to understand is this is tracking the citational index of the documents that I'm looking at. Nothing have I invented because I thought, oh, this seems to be similar. What I'm trying to do is say, how can you stay concrete and analytically charged at the same time and work with that concreteness? Each of these mark zones of exclusion and enclosure through mutations rather than correspondence, morphemes rather than fixities, through urgent and partial borrowings. They borrow each other's terms, but also their policies and populations, through congruences sought rather than through discreetly marked relations. What emerges from such a tact is a colony as a political concept with multiple and unstable balances. Michel de Certeau might have included it among those histoires déplacées that I mentioned before, contrary and suspended on the fringes and beyond the colonial archive's long shadows. And that's what I'm trying to do, is reach beyond the colonial archive shadow. Such a strategy presses on the uncertainties, the self-evident features of what we imagine a colony is, what it does, and how we know it. Here one might take up Foucault's methodological insight, which I referred to last week, and in the week before. I probably refer to it every time I ever give a talk, as an historical event marked by the breach of self-evidence. So when I'm sort of methodologically keeping close to here, is when does the colony not appear self-evident to those actors who are trying to decide who should be in it, what to do with it, and where the funds for it should come from. And the breach of the self-evident gets me far, I feel, to those moments in which knowledge things are being assembled, but then when they're disassembled as well, and they fall apart. So there's this stability, this motility, and its moments of arrest. It is in these breaches of strong and weak duration and intensity that we might locate the tenuous qualities of what a colony could be, its oscillation in form, the political rationalities that underwrite it, its deployment in policy and practice between charged political concept and innocuous common noun. And I'm arguing that this distinction and the space between common noun and political concept is actually a politically very potent one, because it gets bypassed very easily. You're just using it as a common noun. It does no work. When in fact, I think it subjacently does a lot of work. Genealogical work as critical methodology here alerts us to stay on the track of dispersion. And that was the key word that Foucault used when he talked about what a genealogy does. It's not that it all comes together in an ordinary moment. It's not that it comes together as an essence. It's where it disperses, right? Rather than unities. And the term he uses to the dissension of other things. Abstractions offer little help, as does theory, I think. Our course is patiently documentary. It calls to question concepts, what Foucault called those ready-made syntheses, taken to be settled and true. It opens up words at those moments when things tear from their earlier incarnations. For some who inhabit it, a colony is both a promise and the anticipation of a future. For others, it is a suspension of time. The ordinary is reordered in a cordoned off designated space, in a holding pen that constricts which forms of public sociality are allowed for some. It's self-discipline, some within it, to clarify and invest in its internal frontiers. Others to abide by those distinctions, as it bars the use of public space to those others. It nourishes suspicion and further confines the recalcitrant. So that suspicion is an ontological part of the colony itself, on all sides. A colony criminalizes dissidents, disassembles and punishes those who refuse its terms and it suppresses participatory politics. And it suppresses participatory politics, actually, for colonized and colonized, and particularly for those mixed in between. It produces and identifies enemies. That's one of the things it does again and again. from within and without, eagerly invests in the hunt, and it is a hunt for those targeted as a threat, imagined to be a threat, and anxiously celebrates the ever false and short-lived security that follows the repeated rites of capture. So every decade, as we just captured them, we just got rid of the enemy, and new ones come into being. The colony's agents are emboldened by the fervent search for those who elude its strictures by disguise and feigned acquiescence. So that whole group that is always looked upon with méfiance, with suspicion, who are too white or too European or speak Dutch or French too well, or whites that go too close to native custom and clothing. The disdained and most held in contempt are those whose speech, class, and comportment have been educated to fit, those who threaten to almost pass. So passing is actually this site of the enemy in the making, because the enemy is internal. That is the enemy among us, and always among us all. If the concept of security, as Foucault argued, is one that works on possible events, as much as on those that are recurrent and operative, then the colony as a political concept is in part defined by its potentiality. The colony is not just a thing that's there, right? It's the potential for what it has to avert, what it can be, how much it can turn into something else. The problem of security may be muted or manifest, confronted or quelled with different degrees of rigor and intensity, but the incitement to create and leverage security is at its heart. And this is something I've been arguing before 9/11 for a long time, that a genealogy of security is one that is still to be written, of the ways in which security regimes have emerged out of colonial counterinsurgency projects. Agamben has insisted that security has become, I quote, the veritable paradigm of government today. But I think he's wrong. It has been paradigmatic and elemental for the practice of imperial governance far longer than his assertion suggests. That doesn't mean that it's not paradigmatic now, but unless one understands the genealogy of its very making, where are we in understanding what the force it has and what it commands? It's certainly not new. The discrepancy raises an issue that has both eluded Foucault's treatment of the carceral archipelago, from which he excluded very carefully the penal colony as too early, and the camp, Solzhenitsyn's the camp, the Gulag, as too extreme. This is not part of his carceral archipelago. And it's eluded Agamben's treatment of the refugee camp as the exception that has become the nomos of the model in his argument. The colony and the camp are both containments, enclosures, and unsettled encampments that are more closely allied than we have imagined. Nor are they tethered inversions, mirror images, as we might more expect. That's kind of what you said. It's just the opposite of the camp, right? As historical formations, the history of this is so much richer, so much denser, so much more difficult. As historical formations, they feed off one another. They're parasitic components of what I call a political matrix, in which they bleed into one another until they're strategically torn apart. And that's some of what the lecture is about next week, but I hope I get to some of it today, that where the terms themselves, or they can't decide whether something is going to be a colony or it can't. And and then pull them apart in certain historical moments. One might argue for their shared family resemblance, in Wittgenstein's sense of family resemblance. Not any one essential core feature, so much as both being part of, as Wittgenstein put it, an overlapping, crisscrossing set, and I quote, a complicated network of similarities, unquote. That resemblance, however, varies in scale. And I think that's really hard to get hold of. It's not as if it stays at the same scale all the time, that you can just compare the kind of barriers that are in a camp, or that we can just compare what the food regimes are like. That scale of comparison actually shifts historically as well. Really, I think, difficult to get hold of. Colony and camp make up a conjoined, conceptual matrix as well. Twin formations that give rise to social deformations with different effects. The concept of security shapes the imperial coordinates of polities far before it takes over how national logics of security operate. So security, a lot of the work in IR, international relations, security regimes, is all about this current moment of it, right? This is security, new national logics, it's all a national logic. No, this goes much further back. As Foucault described the aim of his work on security in his 1978 Collège de France lectures, I quote, "This technology of security consists in large part in a reactivation and transformation of juridico-legal techniques and of disciplinary techniques," unquote, in place much earlier. So it's not just of the 19th century modern nation state. They borrow and blend essential features of their protective, this is important, protective, curative, and coercive architecture. And that coercion and cure is there at the same time. What I argue is that they are in deadly embrace from the start. Such a perspective fundamentally alters the carceral archipelago, expands its political coordinates in time and space. If for Foucault, the carceral archipelago served as a conceptual metaphor to identify, and I quote, a carceral continuum that diffused penitentiary techniques to the most innocent of disciplines, transmitting disciplinary norms to the very heart of the penal system, and more importantly, to the depths of the social body, unquote. Its web was cast both more than literally and more widely, far more literally, than his account would suggest. And I hope, I don't know if I'm going to have time to talk about, again, which I mentioned last week, this conceptual power of metaphor and how we think about metaphor. And what Foucault does with this metaphor is fascinating because he pushes away from it. He says, I never use geographic metaphors. Absolutely not. And then the carceral archipelago actually stands at the fulcrum of discipline and punishment. As we shall see, refiguring the concept as a carceral archipelago of empire rather than a carceral archipelago of the nation state does more than widen to an imperial net. It refigures the historical projects of which it was a part. And that's what for me is that concrete, that on the ground, as it calls into question its political frame. These agricultural colonies I spoke about, penal colonies, resettlement camps, detention centers, island military bases, settler communities were all nodes in a network, plated through, the word plated, braided through, right? That made it up. The archive, and this is important methodologically. How much time do we have? 5 minutes? 2 minutes? Oh, no. It was on that part. The archive through which I track the history, it's not a proper colonial archive. but what I call a virtual archive, in the sense that no one has gathered it together, assigned it a place, made it a related set of documents with authority of the archive. It is not ours, most importantly, to make. It's a virtual archive that traces, and this is, again, methodologically. If you notice, I talk a lot more about method than I do about theory. That traces the commensurabilities that social reformers and state agents called upon, the examples they enlisted, and the comparisons they thought reasonable to make. So it's based on how did they possibly imagine to compare a Russian orphanage and an Algerian military camp. One was in a logic that could make these come out in a 500-page book on the poor and agricultural colonies. That's what I'm trying to understand, not to place it into my political logic, but to understand something of a political logic for which we don't have a ready frame. It was they who compared Siberian penal colonies, children's agricultural colonies, failed agricultural colonies from mixed blood Indo-Ute in Java. All of these were artifacts of deliberate and concerted design. They're all designed. None of these just plopped up, just came from nowhere. With recursive, modular borrowings among them. And this modular quality is something that Fred Cooper and I began writing about maybe 20 years ago, that things don't just borrow the whole hog, the whole thing, but pieces of them, parts of them, and then reconfigure them together. So it's not that British, Spanish colonialism is the template for British. It's a modular kind of history that we need to access, and which we really have very little access to. The conceptual work marshaled to maintain the colony as a political principle renders a colony as transitory and provisional in its very formation. As a political entity, a colony stands apart, right? You always know a colony is somewhere else, but is part of and attached to something else. Ontologically, it exists in virtue of its dependent status, as a subset of another more substantial polity that wields authority over it. Those who inhabit a colony stand in relationship, always, to a broader biopolitical and legal norm, to which those in a colony, by design, are imagined to desire, but cannot attain. So they're always off kilter. Their French is old French, the dress isn't quite up, the newspapers are always a little unconventional or not the real thing. The people born in the colonies, well, they're even worse. They're actually specific names, whether it be Creole, whether it be in Dacia in the Dutch colonies. They could never be really Dutch. They could never be really European because of something about the nature of having been born in close to, too proximate to something in the colonies. Those who inhabit a colony stand in relationship then to this broader a separate and often disparate social status is assigned to its citizens, if they're even called citizens, right? It's always between citoyen and sujet, but there's also something in between citizen and subject. Its subjects are relegated to a different legal norm. Conceptually then, the colony is a tenuous, illegitimate, that's the heart of it, illegitimate political formation that can only sustain itself by enforcing differences that turn people into other social kinds. The political subordination of the colony always augurs a subservience to something else. It's always in the service of something else. Rather than assume unity, I begin elsewhere, and I'll stop in 3 minutes, if I can. Not with a formal etymological exercise, not with the words firm founding in the Latin colonus, farmer, and the verb colera, to till the land. But with what Foucault and Ian Hacking would underscore, it's historical ontology. This tack is tightly bound to the historical coordinates, conceptual and concrete landscape a colony inhabits. Such an approach favors the seemingly peculiar association. So that's where I'm focusing, not on the norm, but on the peculiar associations a colony calls forth, the disparate and converging uses to which the term was put, and those sites it named. One strategy is to follow the trajectories of the term, the uses to which the term was put, and those sites it named. One strategy is to follow the trajectories of the term itself. So that's what I'm doing sometimes, but that would not be sufficient. The other is to track what colonies were understood to do and what adjacencies the management of a colony elicited. That is, the comparisons made by their social engineers. So that's a term that Paul Ravenel uses, that he follows in French modern. With arrangements of people in space that were not named colonies, but that their conceptual architecture called upon. So this is difficult again. It's not that I'm only going to trace over 200 years the name colony, like you do the word race, never you know what race is over 200 years, you don't. It attends to the political imagination of those high and low, charged with their envisioned workings and detailed implementation. Thus, a critical point of methodology. Such a strategy follows the contour of the colony by the range of commensurabilities it called forth and upon. And that is the project that follows from this. Is only, without judgment, following the exact references everywhere they occur to what is a viable comparison and what is not. Modular, modified, and minute variations are not to be distilled and dismissed, but those are to be retained, close at hand. Such a treatment might render historical labor less the enumeration of cases, but as a privileged, generative site where concepts come into creation. I take this to be fieldwork and philosophy on several counts, as it suspends current judgments about how colonial governance operates and the breadth of it. Moreover, it takes as its task two projects. One which traces how commensurabilities are conceived as conceptual, political, and epistemic labor. And two, and really importantly for me, it compels us to imagine a relational history that has been severed as politically and ethically distinct as governing projects. The second part of this paper is on what Foucault misses in Discipline upon it about Maître and the Colonie Agricole and their ties to this much larger imperial project that leads through the Philadelphia prison and the Siberian penal colonies and the children's orphanages throughout Europe. So thank you for your patience. Was that the right amount of time? I mean, I have half the paper left.